Welcome to the High Agency Podcast with your host, Noah Ravoy. To rebuild the West, we must rebuild our virtue. To talk with me about that subject today is my co-author, Ryan Drummond. Welcome, Ryan. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you, Noah. You're very welcome. Hi, guys. My name's Ryan Drummond, and as Noah mentioned, I co-wrote the book, Reprogram Your Life, Your Pathway to Agency with him. And we've been working very closely together on organizing the groups for that. And basically, I'm here today to have a conversation with him about the nature of agency and virtue.
It's very important that we discuss agency and virtue together because it's impossible to be virtuous if you don't have agency, because you cannot choose how to behave. And therefore, even if you behave in a way that could be considered virtuous, since you didn't choose it, it wasn't a virtue.
Yeah.
I'm going to propose a thesis to you, Ryan, that the biggest problem that we have in 2021 surrounding virtue is that so many people see it as cultural and fluid. And this subjective view of virtue is extremely dangerous because it can allow the virtue to be manipulated into anything that the speaker wants. You know, as Western peoples, we desire to be virtuous. We desire to show virtue, to be noble.
Yeah.
And that is being turned against us through this type of manipulation. An example can be the idea that, you know, love is a virtue, but then people say, well, love is love. And they start to love things that are vices. But obviously, it cannot be a virtue to love a vice.
Yeah.
And this issue is not really a new one. Aristotle talked about the Aristotelian mean. So he would say that, you know, between too much and too little of a virtue, so too much and too little love, perhaps, there is a mean. There is a place in the middle that is just right. And maybe there's a spectrum in the middle that's just right. But that's still very incomplete. And it's incomplete because it is not a subjective measurement of virtue. It is completely, it's not an objective measurement of virtue. It's a completely subjective measurement.
Yeah.
I'm going to propose an objective measurement of virtue that can be applied to any proposed virtue to falsify whether or not it's actually a virtue. If we define virtue as actions that demonstrate a person's practice of adhering to natural law, and natural law being whatever is true, whatever promotes our survival, what does not impose a cost on others, and what is reciprocal, if we define virtue that way, we can falsify any proposed virtue and decide what is actually virtuous and what we should actually be trying to implement and be more like in our own lives.
Yeah. To be honest, I'd absolutely agree with you because, I mean, we listed in the book that we wrote a hell of a lot of the virtues you might consider things I'll read from the list that we have. We have strength, we have courage, we have kindness, we have wisdom, we have honesty, love, brotherhood, commitment, and it goes on. But a lot of those things I've always considered they are not necessarily virtuous outright. It depends on our treatment of them because, of course, strength can be misused. I mean, I could be one of the strongest men in the world, but if I only used it to serve my own ends, if I used it to cause harm to others, if I used it to not serve me, mine, and our people, then I wouldn't consider that strength a virtue because it wouldn't be being used virtuously. And I think your way of describing virtue in that it's true, it promotes survival, it doesn't impose a cost on others, and it's reciprocal is absolutely vital to actually measure what virtue can be, you know?
And it's interesting that description of, for example, strength as a tool. It exists. It's something that exists. You are strong.
Yeah.
But it really exists as a potential. All tools have the potential to do work. They're not actually engaged in work unless someone takes them and uses them to do something. And so virtue must be an action.
Yeah.
You know, I describe that as actions that demonstrate a person is living by natural law, is practicing natural law. Yeah. And so all of this potential that we have, a lot of times we're talking about that as potential. People will want to talk up how empathetic they are or more like sympathetic in many cases, or how much they care about everyone. And they talk up those invisible virtues. They can't be detected because they don't have to actually do anything. There's no actual action. Yeah, no way to falsify whether it's a virtue or not because it's it's an unfalsifiable claim of the existence of an idea in their head.
Yeah, and there's no way of actually proving its virtue if you see it through that metric. And I think to stick with current trends, one of the most obvious points of that recently, I would say, would be the murder of George Floyd, for example. Now, a lot of people are very empathetic towards George Floyd, towards his family, towards what happened. And I would sort of think, okay, well, as you said, is it virtuous if you love a vice? Is it virtuous if you love something that's bad? Is it virtuous that you love something that isn't great? And with the current rhetoric surrounding George Floyd, you would easily be able to argue that in that sense, they're showing empathy and they're showing love to something that by your measure couldn't have possibly have been virtuous, simply because the actions of George Floyd when he was alive, they did impose costs on others. They weren't reciprocal. And they may have been true because they happened, and they happened unto reality and people felt the consequences of them. I wouldn't say his actions also promoted survival. And if he's acting in that sort of way, and people as a given are just emptily pouring out this empathy and this love for somebody who was imposing costs on others, and like you might consider the fact that he committed armed robbery with a gang of men, that was imposing a cost on people. His actions could not have been virtuous. And I think what annoys me is when I see when I see the media sort of playing this out as if he's some sort of martyr figure, what they're actually doing is promoting vice, because they're showing empathy to something that did impose costs on others and that wasn't acting reciprocally and that didn't promote survival, because he threatened to take people's lives if they didn't give him what he wanted. He used a lot of counterfeit money, which wasn't particularly helping the economy. He wasn't acting in a reciprocal manner. And whilst
he was high on just about every known drug at the time that he was arrested.
Yeah, precisely. And he was incredibly fixated on his own vices. And from that, you can sort of build this picture of a very aggressive, very selfish, very self-centered individual. And most people who go through life acting in that sort of way, bad things have a tendency to follow them around. Bad things have a tendency to happen to them. And in his case, he ended up being arrested whilst he was high on drugs, and he died, whether it was a result of Derek Chauvin's actions or whether it was a result of the fentanyl he was on, is neither here nor there. The fact is, this particular individual, I don't believe, is worthy of the empathy and the love that people have been showing towards him. And I think it's a perfect example of what you were saying about how modern society has this emptiness behind the virtue it tries to give and the virtue signaling that it does. It signals virtue, whereas if you break it down into, as you said, the adherence to natural law, what you're finding is that the virtues are actually being put towards, the empathy, is actually being put towards vice rather than virtue. And if that starts happening collectively as a society, that society will never grow. That society will never flourish. That society can never adhere to natural law if you take that attitude to the nth degree. And really, it can only result in civilizational collapse if that sort of irreciprocal behavior and the imposition of costs on people without consideration for them, if that is taken to the nth degree within any given society, you don't have a society. What you have is just a collection of animals, effectively. And they're not utilizing their human agency, and they're certainly not utilizing what we would consider as virtue.
And especially when we talk about at the societal level, if we start to look at the failed societal systems in history, most of the time they existed as an opportunity or as an attempt to cheat nature. Some sort of way of cheating natural law. Even most religions are like this. Religious systems, political systems, and philosophical systems existed as a way to excuse behavior that did not conform to natural law, that imposed a cost on someone or wasn't reciprocal or simply wasn't true. And they existed for that purpose, and that often ended up being their downfall. You can only cheat nature so long, and eventually it comes around and it collects its due with interest in blood if necessary. And they might mean the end of your civilization. People are worried about some economic downturn. We could have another dark ages, and they're worried about an economic downturn. And it's really the farther that you've gone not paying that cost to nature, the higher the expense you're going to have to pay when it comes due. And we've been more than 100 years trying to cheat nature through massive amounts of debt, through living on hopes and dreams and promises and lies. And it's catching up to us as a society, not just in the physical, objective ways that are measurable, but even spiritually, it's catching up with society. We see the terrible depression amongst women today. Half of women are on psychotropic drugs. Young men are killing themselves in droves. And all of this has to do with the fact that we have a society that has substituted vice for virtue.
Yeah. And I think
and told us it was a virtue.
That's, yeah, exactly. And effectively, we've been lied to. We've been hoodwinked. And the reason we've fallen for it is it comes back to the description you said about vice. It offers a temporary release from the weight and the burden that comes with existence under natural law. And we have to remember, under natural law, not above it. And I don't think human beings in the entirety of our existence, we've never been above natural law. We haven't superseded nature. We haven't scientifically conquered nature. I mean, you hear scientific professors like Michio Kaku talking about type 1, type 2, type 3 civilizations. We're currently a type 0. We have nothing that we could possibly say would give us the title of being superior to nature. And I think it's quite clear that nature is far above us. And the laws of nature and the things that come with it, like scarcity, like death, it still exists. We haven't conquered those things. And if we try and use vice to temporarily release the pressure of having that to deal with, all we do is we sink into this sense of nihilism. Because I always say that the sort of existence in its own right, it causes human beings to take one of two paths, because the reason is because nature is above us, and because as it stands, we haven't found a purpose within that nature. We haven't found a concrete, objective purpose for human beings' existence. So at the moment, we're almost stuck in an existential limbo, and that existential limbo causes us to go down this forked path. Now, one, I would say, is neuroticism, and the fact that we fear the position that we're in. We don't understand why we're here. We don't understand what we're doing. And we always think sort of, we might never understand what we're doing. We might never. We can easily, any human being can sink into a depressive mindset over that because they don't have it. Or you can take the other route, which involves stoicism, because you need to have that resolve in order to cope with the burden of such an existential pressure. And the fact or the idea that we may one day find purpose. But purpose certainly isn't granted to us by nature. I mean, all nature gives us is life itself. And we have no idea why it's given us that, but we have to cope with that. Now, we can either fall down the route of purposelessness and nihilism, or we can go down the route of virtue, stoicism, shouldering the weight of existence, shouldering the things that come with it, like scarcity, death, natural law as a burden to humankind. And we can think, okay, well, if nature itself isn't granting us a purpose, what we can do is we can either pretend that we have purpose and lie to ourselves. And I think a lot of the Abrahamic religions do that. They pretend that purpose is there, whereas if you ask them to justify it or sort of come up with any concrete reasoning behind why they think what they think, they'll simply say, oh, you just have to have faith. You just have to believe. And whilst, yes, that does offer a degree of mindfulness to those who are happy to believe and those that are happy to have faith, it doesn't offer concrete objective proof. So effectively, we're in this position where if you're not following mindfulness through Abrahamism, and you're not following neuroticism itself and all of the ills that tend to come with it, like vice, like running away, like trying to hide from nature, you have to take another path. And you have to think, okay, well, why not aim to generate and objectively prove purpose for ourselves? Why not do it ourselves? And we know it's possible to do it ourselves because, first of all, we have agency. We know we have agency. We know agency starts when we are infants and we're almost blank slates. And the upper limits of agency go as far as omniscience and omnipotence, total knowledge and total power. And we know that the evolution of human history has slowly but surely gone from strength to strength towards those things. We've increased technology, we've increased understanding, we've increased our awareness. We're still not anywhere near where we would like to be, where we can feel comfortable in existence, but we know it's possible. We know that evolution is possible because it exists in animals all around us. And we can hold firm to the belief that because we know agency exists, because we know we haven't yet mastered its upper limits, because we know we can evolve as a species, and because we know we can discover things from scratch and we can do things from scratch, we can chase purpose ourselves. Now that, to me, that provides me with all of the mindfulness I need in order to survive, in order to shoulder the burden of nature and know that I feel quite content in that path. Because if any, and it doesn't even have to be human, I mean, you could even go as far as to say aliens, if any living sentient species with agency in the universe ever reached the upper limits of agency, then they would effectively transcend into that position of godhood. And they would be able to know all of history. They would be able to know every individual's actions. They would be able to judge. Now, that might not be in the form of an Abrahamic God, such as Christianity or Islam or Judaism might say, but the concept of God doesn't have to be lost just because you don't believe in the Abrahamic side of it, just because you're not willing to say, okay, well, I'll have faith. I'll passively have faith. What I want to say is we should be, rather than passively having faith or falling into misery or falling into nihilism, we should actively chase purpose. And to do that, we need virtue. To do that, we need to chase agency. To do that, we need to uphold civilizational strength and personal strength. And we need virtue in order to do that. Because without virtue, as we've discussed earlier, society collapses. Falsehoods become prevalent, and we can't go in that positive direction to try and find purpose for ourselves.
Absolutely. Let's try to use these rules that we have here to disambiguate the issue of, is tolerance a virtue? Because it's one of the really common virtues that we hear promoted by television, by mainstream media, and by governments, and even by churches. And so tolerance as a virtue, how would we falsify that under the concept that I proposed? So first of all, we'd say tolerance for what?
Yeah.
And that's the first question you're going to want to ask. Tolerance for what? Now, generally, they're going to show you, when you ask about something you don't like and they say, just be tolerant, it's something that's imposing a cost on you. Because if it's not imposing a cost on you and it doesn't affect your survival and it has nothing to do with you reciprocally, you don't care. It's over there. It's out of your sphere of influence. It's not a problem for you. So, you can go be tolerant over there where I don't have to see you. And I don't even care if it's a virtue or a vice because it's not affecting me.
Yeah, there are no costs involved. Yeah. And so, I think in that sense, tolerance is almost akin to, or at least an important component of reciprocity.
Yes. Because that kind of tolerance is a virtue.
Yeah.
Where what you do over there by yourself and don't influence me in it and don't influence me or my people or my family, that's not my problem. I don't care. Go and do it. Have fun. Don't tell me about it. I don't want to hear about it.
Yeah.
And therefore, I'm tolerant in that respect.
That really is the attitude that I take to, for example, trans culture or homosexuality or sexual promiscuity. As long as I'm not being force-fed it, and as long as I'm not having to bear witness to it, as long as it doesn't impose an actual cost on me, I have nothing against people taking that route. They're free to do what makes them happy. The only time that I do take umbrage is when that particular culture is thrust at me and it starts to impose a cost on me and what I would prefer, which is obviously monogamy and sexual chastity and things of that nature. Now, I'm willing to tolerate one, and I suppose I always have been, as long as, like you said, do what you like over there. Don't impose a cost on me. Don't ram it down my throat. Don't make me watch it every day. Don't teach it to my children. Don't and those sorts of things. But in modern society that we live in, because we're entering into this sort of globalist atmosphere where all of those particular vices that I'm willing to tolerate, they're not being left to their own devices. They're being pushed through the education system. They're being pushed through the mass media. And I'm unable to escape that, which means that naturally costs are being imposed on me because I would rather not do that. I would rather not be exposed to it. I would rather not hear about it. I'd rather not have it taught to my children. And it seems as if in that sense, they're willing to impose a cost on me, and that isn't reciprocal. As a result, I have to be anti something that I would otherwise be more than willing to tolerate, were they to do it in their own time, in their own way, in their own presence, and not impose the cost on me. And I think that's one of the major problems that we're finding that's splitting society at the moment, is that actual tolerance isn't being practiced. We're having to tolerate the imposition of costs, and that is being promoted as a virtue. And I don't think it's virtuous to tolerate the imposition of costs. I believe it's a net negative.
Yeah, in fact, this is a part of them trying to mush us all together into one big pile of humanity, instead of allowing us to separate into groups as humans do. We are naturally a tribal species. We are such a tribal species that men like you and I, who have never been in the same room together, have decided that we should be in the same tribe, and we got to get together and be in physical proximity.
Yeah. I mean,
that's how tribal we are. We'll change countries, cross oceans in order to be with other people that we see fit into our tribe.
Yeah.
And yet we're told that we have to mush together into one big lump of undifferentiated humanity. Well, not exactly one lump. There's two lumps. There's the elite lump, and then there's the rest of us all in a big lump, the proletarian lump at the bottom. And this takes something that could have been a virtue, that is tolerance. Throughout history, Europeans have been fairly religiously tolerant in general, despite what some people believe. Even, compared, for example, to the Middle East, very religiously tolerant. And the farther back you go, the more religiously tolerant you find people. However, when we came to this situation where religion had its fingers into government, the religious tolerance had to end after the Reformation, when you now had Protestants versus Catholics, because the powers that be, the government authorities, were now being connected to the church and connected to religion. You now created this situation where no one could be tolerant anymore. Protestants and Catholics could live together until it meant one was going to take power of the government and impose their will on the other. And now you can't live with those people anymore because they're imposing a cost on you. And
there are so many options these days in terms of subjectivity and subjective choices. The door has been opened to so many different subjective choices that individuals, especially in the West, who have access to various lifestyles, various loves, various dislikes, it's been opened up so wide that even with a world that has 250 or 260 odd nations in it, there are still not enough nations to accommodate all of the choices that people have available to them. And this is one thing that always appealed to me when I was reading through proprietarianism, and I was reading through proprietarian doctrine and the proprietarian methodology. One thing that Kurt Doolittle always said was, let 1,000 nations bloom. And effectively what I took from that statement was, let's go back to original tolerance. But in order to do that, we have to break up the melting pot. We have to break up what we're currently being subject to, which is to see tolerance as tolerating the imposition of costs. What we have to do is remove that scenario. We have to reconfigure the way that the world is operating at the moment, because the way it's operating at the moment, it's only going to lead to irreciprocity, anger, hatred, and war, because people are only going to tolerate something up to a certain point when that tolerance is false. And what proprietarianism suggests is that effectively we should open up the doors to allow anybody's subjective preference and subjective tribal preferences to have its own home, to have its own methods of operation, to have its own style, if you will, of getting through existence and getting through natural law. Whereas at the moment, that's not happening. And all of these different subjective values and different subjective beliefs, they're being put together in one place. And I don't know about you, but over the last 10, 15, 20 years or so, in that one place that everyone is, I've seen it simply operate like a pressure cooker. People are getting angrier and angrier and angrier, and the vitriol is increasing and the hatred is increasing, because human beings and virtue were never meant to operate under these forced conditions.
Now, a good example of this is if you listen to the news media, it says, well, the reason that some people are racist is because they've never met other people of another race. But I find it's exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
The people who were raised in a mixed race environment, like a neighborhood where maybe they were a minority, but not much of a minority. There's just a fairly big mix in those neighborhoods where they had a lot of interaction with other races. They tend to be the most, and it's interesting, they tend to be more racist and less hateful.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of I hate those people. It's like I just don't want to live around them because I did that already and it wasn't very fun. And that's the kind of result that you end up getting, is people being what you could say red-pilled or woke about racial issues, or woke about people who they grew up around lots of divorce, and now they have ideas about how marriage should be structured, not always necessarily completely accurate, because they come to a conclusion doesn't mean the conclusion's accurate, but they know they didn't like what they saw, and they don't want the kind of marriage that their mother and father had, or that their neighbors had, because they saw it fail.
Yeah.
All of this is exposure to these things tends to give us an actual opinion. When we have no exposure, we tend to have a very lightly held opinion.
Yeah.
How does it feel to be shot? Like, I don't really want to be shot, but I think if I'd been shot before in the past, I would not want to be shot even more than I want to not be shot now, because I would have some I remember that. That was really unpleasant.
And you find that psychological phenomenon even occurs among elite athletes.
Yeah.
And you find that if an elite athlete has suffered, for example, a horrendous injury. Now, I've seen a hell of a lot of this happen in football, soccer, where a player may have suffered a horrendous injury. And when they come back from that injury, they have that psychological barrier to overcome, where they find it more difficult to enter into, for example, tackles or challenges, because they, in the back of their mind, they fear that happening again. They don't want it to happen again. And if people experience negative things, it tends to erode things like that mindless courage and mindless bravery and the willingness to get stuck in, because all of a sudden, you know what the consequences can be, and you've suffered them and you don't want them to happen again. And this, it's not so much something that even happens through society, but this is something that's fundamentally a psychological part of being human.
Yeah. And the best way to ensure that people are going to have negative experiences together is to force groups of people who have different life strategies. And that's the best way to describe it. Different life strategies is force those people to have to cooperate in living in the same commons.
Yeah.
This is especially true when their life strategies are about the external things. They're different. If they have different food choices, nobody cares. It's when their idea of what is a safe neighborhood. In Twitter today, there was a woman advocating that there's a young black woman going to stab another black woman, and the police officer shot her. And there's several women on Twitter suggesting that knife fights between young people is just a normal thing, and we should just let it happen. And I mean, if you want to advocate for tolerance of your young people stabbing each other in your neighborhoods, and it's not in my neighborhood, cool, you can do it if you like.
Yeah, do that by all means, but don't drag us into it, because
don't drag us into it.
Yeah, because some people don't want to tolerate that, because, well, as far as I'm concerned, that wouldn't be considered virtuous behavior, and I don't want to have tolerance for a vice. I don't want to have a tolerance because other people want to stab each other and want to cause small reigns of terror within themselves and who they are. I don't want to exist around those people.
I'm pretty tolerant of young boys getting in a fist fight and punching each other a few times, and having limits, understanding where it's gone too far. Stabbing people, you get hit. It's actually not. You find out it's not such a big deal. You get stabbed and you find out it's a really big deal.
Yeah,
I've known people. I've hired people to work for me who just got out of prison, and they're limping along because they were stabbed in the leg with a very small prison shiv. And this guy, he limped the rest of his life. One little tiny stab in his leg only went in about an inch, and he limped for the rest of his life. And he was in pain in that area the entire time that I knew him for about 2 years. And it is serious, and you get hit in somewhere that's not a leg, you get hit in a vital organ. It doesn't take very far to go in for it to be terminal before the ambulance can get there. And what kind of ambulance really wants to roll up on a fight where people are stabbing each other? So it's likely that you're not going to get medical help. And this is, if there are groups of people that want to live like that, they should have the chance to go and live in the way that they live. If they don't want the police to come and settle issues in their neighborhood, then let's be tolerant and let them do it in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
Not in my neighborhood.
Yeah. And I think that would re-inject the virtue into tolerance itself. But I think at the moment, as we're all forced in a way to tolerate things that don't sit well with us, that don't align with our evolutionary strategy.
Well, they don't just impose a cost. Instead of promoting our survival, they actually hinder our survival.
Yeah, they do.
And one of the good examples of that, and this hopefully doesn't get you can't demonetize me because I don't get paid for these videos, but hopefully doesn't get the video taken off. And we won't say the specific name of the illness that we've been being annoyed by for a little over a year now. But the imposition of lockdown measures on people has been deemed a virtue by the media and by government.
Yeah.
But it is very clearly a vice.
Yeah.
And it is clear enough that it is a vice that many people have decided to resist those measures and work against them to the best of their ability. I don't wear the mask ever, anywhere. And you're living in the UK at the moment, and you can get your head caved in by a police officer because you didn't put a piece of cloth on your face to stop a disease that you don't have from killing someone that you don't know because they were obese and didn't take care of their health.
Yeah, it's more so what gets me. It's the erosion of free choice. It's the erosion of personal freedom. And I think that's what annoys a lot of people. I'm picking up an echo, by the way.
I will mute it, and I will get a Bluetooth headphone for me.
Okay, sure thing.
But you can keep talking in the meantime.
Okay. But yeah, as I was saying, it's the erosion of personal freedom and personal choice. And I think just as much as the powers that be force us into these melting pots where we're all forced to tolerate things that don't sit well with us and we don't enjoy and we don't like, the same thing happens with lockdown. Now, some people will be more than happy to sit indoors, wait until it all blows over, make sure they keep themselves safe. Other people don't want to do that. I believe there should be a system in place which allows people their individual freedom, providing they're not imposing costs on others. And I would suggest that restricting somebody's freedom is one of the highest costs that you can impose on a person. Are you almost back? Let me know when we've got you.
I can hear you, but it's on the wrong microphone. Just a second. It's on the wrong
okay. That's fine.
Okay, I think it's going through here now. Okay, good. We're back on.
Excellent.
Yes, this imposition of costs on individuals and communities is why people are resisting the COVID. Probably shouldn't say that. They name tag it, but why they're resisting this so much. And the next phase of this is to impose taking a vaccine on people.
Yeah.
Now, in my case, I have nothing at all to lose from COVID. I am not in a high risk group. Mm-hmm. For me, it would just be a cold. I wouldn't have any serious repercussions. I don't have anyone in my family that's old. All the old people are dead, or pretty darn close to it, and are going to die anyway. So, they die of COVID or they die of the regular flu. It doesn't really matter. Mm. And so, for me, there is no possible upside to taking a vaccine. It's purely downside, and that is the definition of imposing a cost.
Yeah, absolutely. And
even if the potential for a cost is fairly low, it's still a massive cost on me. And we can't impose those costs on others. Meanwhile, as a person who does not have this disease, I am a zero risk to other people.
yeah,
So it not only it imposes a cost on me, it doesn't give any benefit to other people for me to take a vaccine.
yeah. And I think another thing to bear in mind as well is that were people's trust in the figures of authority that are sort of telling us to do all of these things, were the trust levels higher and we had reason to trust them, I think more people would be happy to go along with it. But if you look over the last 20 years, or well, last 20, 50, 100 years almost, how often have we as a people been lied to by those in a position of power and authority? It's so often, so frequently that we've been misled, we've been lied to, and we're fully aware of that. We're not stupid as individuals, we're not stupid people. We know that we've been lied to multiple times, and we know that all of the information that is coming out at the moment regarding that illness is often conflicting with itself. We know that we can only believe things that we can see with our own eyes, and a lot of people haven't seen the damage that has been described with their own eyes, and we know that these people have a history of lying to us. So trust really between the average citizen and the powers that be, so to speak, is at an all-time low. Certainly within my lifetime. I don't think whether I could speak to anybody with any religious alignment, with any political or ideological alignment, if I said to them, "Excuse me, sir, do you have trust in the government?" I don't think the answer would be yes many, many times. A lot of people would take umbrage at the fact that they'd simply been misled so often. And that trust is not there. And when you're living in a low trust society, whilst simultaneously having your freedoms restricted because of something that you have no way of proving and no way of understanding, of course, it's going to raise questions. It's going to raise animosity. And it doesn't exist under any lens of virtue. It's only the imposition of costs from people that we don't trust, from people that we don't think have our interests at heart. And they've demonstrated many times that they don't have our interests at heart.
So let's bring this back around to the viewer and what the viewer himself can do. So we described what virtue is, and I'm going to put in the notes below this video the actual quote that I have here on what is a virtue. When we talk about, for example, we have negative emotions and distrust of the government because they weren't being virtuous. They weren't behaving in a virtuous way towards us. We can get the same sense of distrust and negative feelings towards ourselves. So we can stop trusting ourselves if we don't behave virtuously. We can stop, someone told me that they don't trust this has happened many times. I don't trust my choice in men or women or whatever. I don't trust myself to not drink. So, I was an alcoholic and I don't trust myself not to drink. So I need to never touch alcohol again. So they've had this lapse of virtue, and they see the only solution being to not trust themselves. And the way that an individual, once you get in that position, you're going to have those negative feelings about yourself for a very long time if you don't start to develop virtues, which allow the trust to rebuild.
And the virtues have to be quite objective. They have to be quite rigid. It's like, I'm not sure who it was that originally said this, but self-love is an involuntary response to our virtues and our displayment of them.
That was a modification of a Stefan Molyneux quote. He said love is, and I said self-love is also that, because self-love is also a form of love. And in order for us to love ourselves enough to bother investing into ourselves and into developing a better life for ourselves, we have to have some idea of what virtues we have. And, that's something that I encourage the listeners to do. When you're done this video, is take a pencil and paper. Don't write it on your computer. Take a pencil or a pen and paper and write down what you think your virtues are. And then write down why you think those are your virtues. And then use the falsification we have here to make sure they're actual virtues in the way that you're acting them out in your life. And focus on your actions. How do your actions demonstrate virtue? And then also look, how do your actions perhaps demonstrate a lack of virtue, and what can you do about it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think
And
that's
that's very,
exactly,
very important.
it's a great method for
People will,
anyone to use.
yeah. If someone says, I feel I lack courage.
Hmm.
Okay. What do you mean by that? What is the action that you're going to show? Okay,
Yeah.
I haven't had the courage to talk to my friends and family about the things that I believe in. I'm going along with whatever it is, the societal wave of ennui, the status quo,
Hmm.
and I know it's wrong, and I'm afraid to say anything different. Okay, now you've got it down to an action. Would telling your family and your friends that you don't believe the lies you're being told be virtuous?
Hmm.
And take a look. Does it follow natural law? I'm not going to give the conclusion to the viewer. Look at this and then decide, how will you develop that virtue? And think each time of not developing courage, but developing courage to do X, whatever that thing happens to
Yeah,
be.
courage to do something. I mean, we make the distinction of to be versus to do
Yes.
in Reprogram Your Life. We mentioned that to be is constantly left in the realm of the subjective. You can never pin it down. Whereas to do, you've actually got to do something. You've got this metric through which to verify your actions, through which to verify your virtues. And if you use the model that you said, is it reciprocal? Does it impose costs on others? Does it promote human survival? And I would take that element back to the nature of human existence and neuroticism and stoicism. And is it true? Is it real? Is it tangible? If anyone uses that metric, they can easily decide whether what it is that they believe, what it is that they're doing, and their actions, whether or not they're virtuous, whether or not they're actually there. And as well, I think it was Aristotle paraphrasing something that Plato said when he said that virtue has to be done for its own sake. Virtue has a certain list of requirements. And there's a quotation that he said, "In the case of the virtues, an act is not performed justly or with self-control if the act itself is of a certain kind, but also that the agent," going back to agency, ourselves, "has certain characteristics as he performs it. First of all, he must know what he's doing. That's the truth element of it. Secondly, he must choose to act the way that he does. You must choose to act in a way that doesn't impose cost on people. You have to choose that. You can choose one way or the other. And he must choose it for its own sake. And in the third place, an act must spring from a firm and unchangeable character." Now, going back to what you said at the very beginning of this show, the way virtue is described these days is very fluid, very changing. It's almost ever changing in society, the way it's put forward. And that is not the way that Aristotle saw it. Now, if you go back to the ancient Greeks, they almost were the original definers of what the virtues were and how they operated and how they related to a sense of purpose. And if we're not following that model and we're allowing it to be something fluid, and that fluidity is leading to the breakdown of society, the breakdown of people's mental health, there's no virtue there. We've lost our way. And I think the way the world is at the moment, I think I would be hard pressed to find any individual who could take a look at the state of the world or even their own neighborhoods and not agree that to some extent humanity has lost its way.
What would you say to people who make the argument that in the time we live in, being virtuous actually is bad for your survival? It'll hinder you. It's going to make it harder for you, and you better just be completely Machiavellian and say and do whatever you have to survive. What would you say to that argument?
When you think of the Machiavellian traits, again, I consider them tools. They can still be used virtuously. Now, of course, if you're trying to act virtuously in a world that lacks virtue and you take it to the nth degree, you're going to make enemies. You're going to make enemies, just as much as Jesus Christ himself made enemies and he ended up on the cross for it. If you take virtue to the nth degree and you promote it, people won't like you. That is where you need courage. And that, I think, in order to shoulder that particular courage, you need the mindfulness that comes with having a sense of purpose. If you're acting virtuously and you don't have that overarching sense of purpose, which elevates maybe not the self, but the spirit to the level of nature itself and to the level of total agency and to the level of godhood. If you don't have that mindset and you don't have a reasoning to have that in place, you're going to suffer a great deal. If you do have the mindfulness, because you've got a sense of purpose, because you've got a sense of understanding that your actions don't just matter in the here and the now, but they matter for all eternity, then you will generate the courage naturally to be able to hold firm and to be quite comfortable with yourself. And almost, to go back to the Jesus Christ metaphor, he accepted his death willingly because he had that level of mindfulness. And he accepted the fact that people may not like him because he had that level of mindfulness. Without it, he'd have cracked under pressure, and we probably wouldn't have today that idea of Jesus Christ as a virtuous man, because he wouldn't have been able to act to that capacity. What we need is to try and reinstill that sense of overarching purpose that aligns our spirit and our actions with the totality of natural law and our current place, which is beneath it. And without that, people are going to really suffer. They're going to struggle.
You brought up something really important. You talked about an eternal view versus the immediate benefits.
Yeah,
so very often, we spoke about this earlier, very often a vice is about immediate benefits at the expense of long-term gains.
Yeah.
And so individuals who are saying we should just enjoy the decline, do whatever you want, just, live and, forget about virtue. The dog. No problem. Forget about virtue. They're essentially having that very short-term view, that view of in the here and now, living a life full of vice can be pleasurable.
Yeah,
and you could say that pleasure is a virtue, not when it's acquired through a vice, but you could say it is a virtue to have pleasure. It is something that is, a true pleasure is good, promotes our survival because it reduces our cortisol. It's enjoyable. It doesn't impose a cost on others, and it can be reciprocal. Everyone can enjoy themselves.
Yeah.
This, however, when it's achieved through vices, it is a very short-term thinking.
Yeah.
And the longer vision that we can have, the higher agency we tend to have. So as our agency increases, we stop thinking so much about the here and now, and we start thinking about tomorrow, next month, next year, next generation, next civilization. What are we leaving for the next civilization? And that really modifies the choices that we make and makes us behave much more virtuously.
Yeah.
Even if we put aside the long-term, why do we exist? And we at minimum say that there's at least a midterm reason. So for many people, they have the short-term reason for pleasure. That's why they exist. The midterm reason is so that we can create high agency children. That's the midterm reason, and high agency grandchildren. And the long-term, maybe we haven't figured that out yet. We won't get there if we don't have the midterm.
Yeah, absolutely. And we won't be able to get there if we fall as a civilization to immediate vice. We won't be able to extend the duration of what we can achieve. We won't be able to evolve to that, having that level of agency where we might consider ourselves a type 1, type 2, type 3 civilization. We need to maintain a certain degree of social coherence, stability, and a trajectory in order to actually get to that position where we're able to generate that purpose for ourselves. Now, we can either sit back and, like I said earlier, we can either sit back and wait for the idea of the Abrahamic God to do it for us, or we can look at the reality of our situation, accept that no, we have no objective proof at the moment that we have purpose, but we want to get there because naturally human beings, we've always been a very curious species. We're hardwired for self-survival. We're hardwired to almost ask those larger questions through sentience, because we see that the raw elements of life, when we can take it all in and when we see what goes on around us, the short term's not great. I mean, life is suffering. There's a hell of a lot of suffering that has to be involved in life. And if people are only thinking in the short term, what they're doing really is they are showing themselves to be fearful of that suffering. They want to hide away from it. They want to hide away from the suffering that natural law and nature itself imposes on the human condition. That's why people turn to things like drugs and alcoholism and loose sex, because they're seeking those short-term pleasures which allow them to ignore the fact that they have no purpose, that they have nothing going for them, that there's nothing actually there, that their life has no meaning. And they're trying to fill that void. But because human beings are, well, we're not above nature, filling that void with things like vice can only be a temporary thing. Whereas in order to look long term, we simply have to shoulder the fact that we have no purpose and we have a job to do.
The purpose is to discover purpose.
Yes, that's precisely it.
Purpose is discover purpose. And, you know, even in the short term, when we live a virtuous life, we tend to then be surrounded by more virtuous people. The worst part about living an unvirtuous life is the kind of shit tier people that you attract into your life. Yeah. And the fact that you can chase good people all you want, they won't stay in your life if you're not virtuous, because people seek, exactly, unless your actions demonstrate it, because people seek their level. They seek people like them. And as we rise up through the development of our own virtue, we will find that we probably leave behind a lot of friends. We might leave behind family. We might grow beyond where we find them as suitable people to be in our life anymore. And this isn't being, you know, judgmental or condemning them. We just, usually what actually happens is it's not the virtuous person that leaves the unvirtuous. It's the unvirtuous who, having their lack of virtue exposed through connection to the virtuous, become ashamed and then pull away from the virtuous people.
Yeah, or they attack the virtuous people.
Or attack them, yes.
Yeah.
And actually, we're seeing that right now. You know, those who are willing to question authority, those who are willing to stand up to illegitimate authority are being attacked by the virtue mob, saying that they're hate-filled, they're this, they're that, they're the other thing. They're every kind of lack of virtue that the virtue seekers, the virtue fakers, I could say, want to pretend they have. And so we can fight that as individuals by looking at our own virtues objectively. I really think this is one of the very early things that anyone who's suffering from depression, and depression isn't necessarily sadness, it can simply be an internal deadness. Most men that I know, their depression isn't sadness, they just feel kind of dead inside.
Yeah,
is to lost. Start looking, lost, exactly, is to start looking back at your own virtues and what ones you want to develop. And being objective with that, which means to write it down, because if it's only in your head, it's not real. The moment you write things down, they become real. A thought becomes real when it's written down.
Yeah.
And so write down your thoughts, write down what virtues you're developing, and have a look. You know, there's some wonderful systems of virtue over time. We have, for example, the 4 classical cardinal virtues in Christianity, which are temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. There's the Prussian virtues, things like austerity, courage. Courage is in almost every virtue system. Determination, discipline. There's Bushido has 8 virtues. Rectitude, which means justice or setting things right. Courage, again, benevolence or mercy. Politeness and honesty and sincerity. So there's a bunch more as well. Go and start looking up codes of virtue.
Yeah.
You know, make a copy pasta where you start printing these out, or you start looking at them, and make a little binder where you can go back and look at these virtues and perhaps write your own handwritten definitions of what these mean in your life, what this would look like. What does it look like for me to be courageous in my life? What does it look like for me to be just in my life?
Yeah.
How do I treat others with justice? Great example. Do I expect more from people than is possible for them to display?
Yeah.
You know, look at how you can apply these virtues in your life and internalize them, enjoy them, and then celebrate when you express these virtues, not to other people. It's the end of the day and you go, you know what? I stood up for what I believe today. That felt really good. It was really hard, but I felt so good afterwards, and celebrate it a bit. Remember it. Reinforce those neural pathways that say, this is behavior we want. And when you have vices, you do the same thing, and you suppress those neural pathways. And eventually you become a person who reacts naturally with virtue.
You almost have to become your own judge. You almost have to become your own judge. And I think if you follow the metric that you described, where is your behavior coherent with natural law? Is what you're doing true? And you can judge yourself via your actions, not via your desires or via your wishes, but via your actions. You have to say, is it true? Does this promote survival? Not just for myself, but for my tribe, for humanity as a whole, even.
And not just momentary survival.
Yeah.
Does this promote my long-term genetic survival?
And does this impose a cost on others? Is this behavior reciprocal? And I think you could add a final one on there. Does this behavior allow me to continue showing that I'm on the side of seeking purpose, not just for myself, but for humankind? And I think with that in mind, if you can start seeing your own behavior mirror those requirements, not only will you slowly learn to love yourself and trust yourself and believe in yourself, but if you've got that long-term thinking, that long-term purpose, that long-term trajectory that you're aiming for, not just for yourself, but for your descendants, for the descendants of other civilizations, for the descendants of all humanity, and where we may go and where we may take our agency, if you can do that, you'll find peace of mind.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for joining me today. This has been a fantastic discussion. You know, it was thousands of discussions like this and thousands of hours of us researching and thinking and doing and acting in our life and working with clients and helping other people and applying these concepts to help people who have anxiety and depression and neuroses and lack of feeling that they have purpose in life. The end result of that was this book, Reprogram Your Life, and the course that goes with it that Ryan and I teach. If you want to be part of that course, there's a sign up in the links below underneath this video. If you can't find the sign up link, just contact me, DM me, contact me, make a message on these videos, however you'd like to get your message across, and I will look you up and find you. You can also Google my name, Noah Ravoy, and you will find my website, and then you can send me a message there. If you're looking to develop your virtue, Ryan and I can help you. Thank you very much, Ryan. It's been wonderful having you on the show today.
Thank you.
We're going to have to do this again with another fantastic subject in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, we will do.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you for watching our video, and I hope it inspired you to take action in your life. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video to get more agency building content. The real secret sauce is in our newsletter. Click on the link in the video description below to sign up. I promise I won't flood your inbox, and anything that we do send you will be of high value.